Hear the Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark.
Glory be to thee, O Lord.
Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by the way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay a hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and then he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed. And he said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise be to thee, O Christ.
So please be seated. Who do you kind of look down on? Who do you regard as somehow lesser? This passage, this phrase in James, the poor in the world. I was reading this in, quite closely, and I was sort of studying the way it's written and all this kind of thing. And it's the more I thought about that particular phrase, the poor in the world, the more, if you like, ambiguous it became. Because it could mean poor in the eyes of the world, those who, if you like, are looked down upon by the world. It could mean poor in station in the world, those who are lacking esteem or lacking position in society. Or it could mean those who are lacking worldly goods. It could mean simply those who are a bit broke or whatever. So superficially, it just means those who aren't very well off. But as I thought about this idea of the poor in the eyes of the world, or poor in station in the world, I thought, well, who is looked down upon in our culture now? Who is looked down upon in society? And the thought irresistibly came to me. The one person who seemed to be hated by everyone, who looked down upon and sneered and despised by everyone I could think of, was Donald Trump. He seemed utterly loathed. And the people who support him. And I thought, one word, the people that voted for Trump, according to this, are poor in the world. Because they are sneered at, they are despised, they're looked down upon. Is he talking about them? Because a lot of them actually aren't very well off either. Typically he got his vote from the Rust Belt, as they put it, from the post-industrial cities of the Midwest and from the rather poor rural communities that aren't doing particularly well at the moment, small towns in the middle of nowhere that aren't going anywhere. In other words, the poor in the world are the ones that voted for him. Typically, the people that are well off and well educated and living in the good places didn't. And Jesus has said the poor in the world, James has said, have been chosen to be rich in faith. And then you remember the Beatitudes. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor." And as I've thought about those, I'm thinking, who wants to be blessed? Would you like to be blessed? And I think most people would like to be blessed. So if we would be blessed, says Jesus, we would be poor. But if we acknowledge our poverty, then we can be blessed. So Jesus is talking about those who know they are poor because they're basically broke, they just don't have much. Because that puts people in a position of vulnerability and humility, where typically they're receptive to the knowledge of God. Because that's ultimately what he's talking about. But really, anyone who knows their vulnerability and their weakness, anyone with that humility is receptive, irrespective of their station in society. So, for example, this Canaanite woman, it's not clear whether this was a poor woman in the sense of lacking worldly goods, or whether she's a wealthy woman. The way that they actually describe her daughter lying down could mean that she's actually lying on a proper bed. In which case, this woman must be moderately prosperous to actually own a proper bed. But she feels destitute because her little girl, whom she loves, has got this demon inside her. And you might remember that story of Jairus and the Jairus' daughter, the ruler of the synagogue. He falls to the ground in front of Jesus' feet, and he's described as a ruler of the people, a great man in the area, a prosperous man, a powerful man, an influential, a man of prestige in the region. And there he is, abasing himself in public. Why? Because his daughter is dead. He's desolate. He feels his poverty. All the other stuff means nothing if his little girl is dead. So he feels his poverty. And Jesus says, blessed are the poor. He was blessed because he received his daughter back. And so I think we're meant to understand these words of poor in both ways at once. Those lacking material goods, because James is obviously talking about them as well. What's it good, as it says, if you wish to someone, have a nice time, be well fed, be well clothed, be comfortable, and then do absolutely nothing to help them. He said, well, what good's that? So he's obviously talking about people who lack worldly goods there. But he's also talking about other things. He's talking about vanity, about the way that we are impressed with people. He said, if some wealthy person comes into your gathering and you say, oh, wonderful to see you, how great, and all this kind of thing, and then you treat someone that comes modestly dressed in shabby clothes with contempt, it's to your shame, he said. You might remember once I was actually told to leave a church because I was so shabbily dressed. I was actually invited to speak at the service, but I didn't look the part when I came in, and so I was told to leave. And obviously if I'd looked the part, I'd have been given a nice seat. And that's precisely the kind of thing I think James is talking about this kind of making distinctions. And one of the deep convictions that has grown in me as I've walked with God is that all the people are the Lord's little ones. All people are made in the image of God. All of us. And it's easy to kind of slant one way or the other. In the Old Testament it actually says, do not favour either the rich or the poor. You have to be fair to everyone. Everyone. And there's something deep in human nature that doesn't want to be fair to everyone. That wants to be fair to the people we approve of. And if you like, not make quite such strenuous efforts to be fair to people we don't really approve of. But Scripture is emphatic that all people are made in the image of God. And that's what is grieving James here. He's saying you've forgotten that this poor man who you're treating with contempt is made in the image of God. He is the Lord's little one. He's the Lord's darling. The Lord loves this man. And what have you done? You've shown him contempt. How dare you? How can you do that? It says in the Old Testament, it says, those who curse the poor despise their maker. Because their maker is God. And yet, we're not to act vindictively and spitefully towards the rich either. Because they are also made in the image of God. We have to acknowledge that in everyone. No matter who they are, no matter where they're from, no matter what they've done, all people bear the divine image. And we have to acknowledge that. Doesn't mean we approve of everything that people do. You know, when people do wickedness, if they're stupid, if they're idiotic, if they're vile in their actions, we have to call it for what it is. We say, no, that's ridiculous, that's not true, that's evil, that's wicked, that's deceitful, that's dishonest, that's a revolting thing to do. We must be honest and straightforward about these things. But at the same time, we must remember that the person doing them is made in the image of God. And somehow we must always acknowledge that. And that, if you like, the universality of that principle is illustrated in these two stories where Jesus, the Jew, the observant Jew, escapes from his community from Galilee and he goes up to this region of Tyre. Now it's a wealthy city, a trading city, and Sidon is another one of them. If you read back through the Old Testament, you realise these are the cities of the Canaanites. These are the cities of the pagans that lived around the Israelites. These places were prolific in human sacrifice at one time. I think the custom had died out by the time of Jesus' life. But there are remains there of what they call a topheth, a place of sacrifice with fire. And in some of them there seems to have been sacrifices of hundreds of children made at one time, because they find the little burnt bones in heaps. And so the Lord hated the religion of those places. He hated the human sacrifice, the killing of children. And it's a curious thing that the Christian church, as it spread around the Roman Empire, cherished children in a way that the other areas, the other cultures did not. A complete opposite of that. And typically the Christians became known that they'd go to the dumps and the gutters in the place where children, unwanted babies, were being abandoned and exposed to die, basically. And they'd pick them up and take them home and look after them. They would cherish them because they were made in the image of God. Every single one of them. You know, there is no such thing as a child beneath contempt in the eyes of God. And so that whole principle against abortion, against infanticide, comes from this basic premise that all people are made in the image of God. And this Canaanite woman is made in the image of God. And there's this little dialogue. I think we need to understand this conversation in the light of the fact we just had the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus distributing the bread. And you might remember he takes the little boy's lunchbox and he shares it out, and they have 12 baskets full that come back. An enormous abundance of crumbs and leftovers. Now the crumbs, if you like, were more than the original lunchbox. The children, the Israelites, were fed. And out of the crumbs there came back baskets and baskets and baskets of leftovers. Now here Jesus is giving out some of the leftovers in Tyre and Canaan. And that's because the leftovers are bigger than the original amount, because there's more people that are not Israelites. There are more people that aren't Israelites in the world than there are Israelites. So the leftovers need to be bigger. They need to be more voluminous and more prolific, because there are more people to feed. So the principle is established. Jesus wants the leftovers, and he wants them to be given out to the whole world, because all the people are being received into the kingdom of heaven, wherever they're from. And so Jesus is showing to his friends, look, this woman whose little girl has this demon, they are both made in the image of God, and they are being received into the kingdom of heaven. And as a sign of this, I will deliver this little girl. They will eat the crumbs from the table. They will eat your leftovers, because your leftovers are actually more than what you originally had. The leftovers are going to fill the whole world. What I've begun here in this day is going to spread everywhere. And then it's unclear whether this deaf man is an Israelite or not. The Decapolis was an area of Greeks. So they're not Israelites, they're pagans. So it could well be, because they've mentioned this, that he's come from Tyre and he's now going to the Decapolis, that they're talking about another pagan area, another pagan man who is deaf and dumb. The way it's written, it's not that he was, if you like, born without the function of hearing and therefore with no function of speech. It's as if somehow he has lost his capacity to hear and therefore speak. Because they talk about a speech impediment rather than being completely unable to make a noise. But he is unable. And Jesus delivers him. Be opened, he says. And it's bounced off this reading from Isaiah. Then shall the eyes of the blind be unstopped, the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame shall leap like a deer. I think that's why they put the reading from Isaiah there, simply because Jesus did that. And it's recorded here because he did it. But this particular thing which he did is recorded for a particular reason. That principle of opening the ears and the mouth is established. And as it says, blessed are the poor. If we poor in our ears and our speech, can we hear the things of God? Do we hear the Lord's voice? Do we speak the Lord's words? Our ears need to be unstopped as well, so that we can hear the Lord our God, our Maker, our Redeemer. Our mouths need to be opened as well, so that we can speak the words of grace and peace that the Lord would give us. But unless he opens our ears and our mouths, we can't do it. We need to know, if you like, our poverty in order to be released and to be blessed. We need to know our weakness that he might make us strong. And so that principle recurs. Those who are poor in the world have chosen to be rich in grace, rich in faith. As we feel our weakness, our vulnerability, we know we need something else, and therefore we look elsewhere. But the Lord in heaven wants us to look to heaven. But those who are satisfied with the world won't bother looking. Those who are absolutely okay, those who think everything's just going fine, why look to heaven? Why bother? Why give yourself a hard time? Why trouble yourselves? Why disturb your peace? Why get out of bed on Sunday morning? Why not just sleep? But if we want the things of heaven, then the Lord will come to meet us. When we realise we need them. In Isaiah it says, open your mouth wide and I will fill it. If we are hungry for his things, he will fill us up. But if we don't feel the hunger, we won't bother looking to be filled. And that leaves us in the true poverty, which is the emptiness of the futility of life without the knowledge of God. That somehow we are denying our divine image. That if we do not acknowledge that God has made us and God will redeem us, we're showing contempt for the divine image in us, in ourselves. Because that's where it's from. An extraordinary kind of inversion, isn't it? That those who are proud in the world, those who are great and beautiful and rich and powerful and think themselves wonderful, they've got no time for the knowledge of God, no time for looking up to heaven. They are actually showing contempt for the image of God in them. And possibly for other people as well. But ultimately it's an act of self-destruction. And that's what the Lord is cautioning us against. And that's why he says, blessed are the poor. And I had a friend once, a Muslim, and he questioned me about this principle of faith a lot. Because in Islam, you've got to do the stuff. You wear the clothes, you go to mosque, you bow, it's all very obvious if you're a practicing Muslim or not. And he found it strange that this Christian principle of faith was that it was kind of invisible. It was something inside. And I have a suspicion that he wanted to have it both ways. He wanted to outwardly be an observant Muslim, but inwardly also wanted, if you like, to bet on the second horse of being a Christian as well. And he wanted to know about this principle of faith. If he believes in his heart, he says he's saved. Is that it? So I said, yes. So, I've just got to believe. I said, yes, that's right. But I said, if you really believe, you will do something. If you really believe, you'll mean it. And you will act. Because if you don't actually act, you don't really believe. You use the analogy of a really rickety-looking bridge. Do you believe the bridge will take your weight across the rushing river 100 feet below? Well, walk on it then. Will you actually do it? Will you actually act on this thing of belief? Because if you won't actually do it, then you don't really believe it. And that conversation went round and round and round and round between us. And that's the crux of the matter that James is talking of. Faith without works is dead. Don't deceive yourself. If you don't actually do it, you don't really mean it. And so, blessed are the poor. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. For though God has chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith. As Thomas said when Jesus said he was going to die, he said, let's go and die with him then. Let's be blessed. Let's acknowledge our poverty, our weakness, our frailty, so the Lord can raise us up.